Hello, everybody, and welcome to this online event on Ukraine's integration and reconstruction, how to prepare the EU. The event is hosted by the Central European University Democracy Institute and the Review of Democracy Journal, the online journal of the CEU Democracy Institute. My name is Iskra Kirova. I'm Senior Policy Analyst at the Open Society Foundations working on Europe and Eurasia, and I will be the chair for today's discussion. I'm very pleased to welcome our panelists and to introduce them, starting in alphabetical order, but also luckily with our host, Professor Laszlo Bruszt, who is co-director of the CEU Democracy Institute and professor of sociology at the CEU Department of Political Science. He has actively participated in the democratic transition of his country, Hungary, as a trade unionist in the 1990s, and he has had a distinguished academic career, and his recent studies deal with the politics of economic integration of the eastern and southern parts of Europe. I'm then very glad to also welcome Andreas Cobilius, member of the European Parliament from the European People's Party and former Prime Minister of Lithuania. He has had an active political career in his native Lithuania, including at the time of Lithuania's struggle for independence from the Soviet Union. And today he serves in various capacities in the European Parliament, including as rapporteur on Russia and chair of the delegation to the Euronest Parliamentary Assembly, and always very actively engaged on Ukraine, Russia, and the Eastern neighborhood. Tymofiy Mylovanov is president of the Kyiv School of Economics. I'm very pleased to welcome him. He has had a distinguished academic career there, but also at a number of European and American universities. And between 2016 and 2019, he was the deputy chairman of the board of the National Bank of Ukraine. More recently, in 2019-2020, he also served as Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Agriculture. And last but not least, Milada Vachudova, who is professor of political science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She specializes in European politics, political change, and post-communist Europe, the European Union, and the impact of international actors on domestic politics. In her book, Europe Undivided, Democracy, Leverage, and Integration After Communism, was awarded the Stein-Rokan Prize for Comparative Social Science Research. So I warmly welcome all of the panelists, and I also welcome our audience online. This event is on the record. It will be recorded. It is live streamed on Facebook right now, and there will be a recording available also later, both on Facebook and YouTube. I invite all of our listeners to submit their questions, prepare their questions. You can submit them on Facebook on the live streaming page of the event, and these will be gathered and then sent to myself and the panelists to incorporate in our discussion. And with that, I really would like to turn to the substance of today's discussion, Ukraine's integration and reconstruction. On the 5th day of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky submitted his country's application for EU membership. And Ukraine has been steadfast in standing up for its European choice. It did so in 2013, 2014, when the Kremlin tried to blackmail it to drop its association agreement and DCFTA with the EU. And it paid dearly with lives, with the loss of Crimea, and with the separatist conflict in Donbass that the Kremlin engineered. And it stands by its European choice today, as it submitted this application while Russian troops were marching in and shelling its cities. As we speak, the European Commission is working in an accelerated manner to prepare the opinion on Ukraine's candidacy, possibly in time for a decision by member states at the end of June, the European Council at the end of June. There is still much uncertainty what member states will decide, and the decision will certainly have implications for Ukraine and also for the EU's long-term strategic future. Can the EU rise to the historic significance of this moment? And what does it require from the EU? What lessons can we learn from the previous experience of enlargement, and particularly the integration of the Western Balkans, but also the previous policy of association, political association and economic integration of Ukraine under the association agreement and the CFTA? And what would it take, and what would be the challenges for the EU in terms of reconstruction of Ukraine? These are the questions that we pose today, these among a number of others. And with that, I turn to our first speaker and host, Professor Laszlo Bruszt, to address these questions and also give us a bit about the impetus behind this initiative by the CEU Democracy Institute. Professor Bruszt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Iskra. That's a very good introduction. I try to explain why we choose to focus on the EU. So those studies that we saw in the recently that talk about the future of the relationship between EU and Ukraine, most of them, they talk about the preparedness of Ukraine and how to achieve its preparedness to become members. And that's usually the typical question, not just in this case, but in the case of Ukraine, that's terribly important because that's, as you yourself mentioned, this is a membership of EU. Ukraine's EU membership is not just about Ukraine, it's about the future of EU. And the reason why we think that, and that's why we think that the real question is how to prepare the EU to integrate, to have the capacity to integrate the EU, is in Ukraine. It has to do with the fact that the war basically challenged lots of the basic principles on which the European project is built. The most important of them is that this is a peace maintaining project built on economic interactions, trade, joint production systems, opening up of the markets, and that is supposed to create the peace. The EU integration is primarily about that, and that is reflected also on the way EU relies on soft power and hard power. The EU built on partly on the trust of the soft power of European integration, partly on the fact that US was always there when there were problems, stressed the strength of soft power, its capacity to attract other countries, its capacity to spread its normative order, both in economic and political terms, with its being there as partly as the largest market of 430 or sometimes even 500 million people, and it's a very attractive social and economic conditions. That is the richest club around. That's two were basis of its soft power. And when the war started, the idea that this combination of very weak hard power and robust soft power is the condition of peace, that was basically challenged. And actually, the first reaction of the EU and the EU leaders was to go back to hard power, to build military constellations, and one can understand that. But in the longer term, the real question is to what extent can the soft power of EU re-established? And because what the Ukraine and case of Ukraine, not just the war, but even the road leading to war signaled. And there are other signals for that, that there are basic problems also with the soft power. of EU. That Milada can, and I think she will also tell a lot about how the integration of Western Balkans did not happen. I will talk about briefly about what are the problems of the Central Europe, but we can see that even within the EU, countries like Hungary and Poland are growing, deviate from the normative order of the EU. So even within the EU, there are problems. And then if you look at the eastern neighborhood of EU, if you look at the economic and other policies or geopolitical steps of EU in the last 10 years, they clearly didn't work. They clearly didn't work. So the war puts basically in a situation the EU in which it has to take a very important longer-term decisions, geopolitical decisions, how to create a new post-war settlement. What would be the settlement with the new settlement in Russia and Ukraine? It's clear now that except for the case that Europe is ready to accept superpower politics in which the Ukraine might be a part of the near abroad of Russia, that EU integration of Ukraine will be one of the central questions in a post-war settlement. The other question is that links both to the reconstruction and European integration is what kind of lessons could be learned from the Marshall Plan. I'm really glad that we have with us Tymofiy Mylovanov, who participated in the new draft that tries to bring in the lessons of the Marshall Plan, which was the first attempt of transnational economic and political integration of Europe. What are the lessons from that? That will be a big question. And then the third question that we might discuss here is what could be lessons from the previous waves of enlargements, from its successes and failures, both in the Central Eastern European countries, the Western Balkans, and the Eastern neighborhood. These are very important questions. Now, in the remaining time, I would like to briefly talk about some of the lessons of the Eastern enlargement. This is one of the areas in which I did considerable research. I think that to cut the long story short, I think that perhaps the most important thing is that EU has to rethink this dilemma of the 1990s when the Eastern enlargement started. In 1990s, the way the dilemma was formulated was that widening of Europe, meaning extension of its boundaries and enlargement of Europe, might weaken or even undermine deepening. That is, there was a pervasive fear, actually, that this enlargement taking in other countries might weaken the future of European integration, weaken the chances of deepening by partly the political integration, but also the creation of supranational problem-solving institutions. One of the reasons why Margaret Thatcher was so enthusiastic supporter of the enlargement, the Eastern enlargement, was that she expected that will weaken the capacity of the core countries to go further with deepening. And actually, one of the lessons that some of the core countries of EU took from the southern enlargement, that actually there is no need for deepening. Market incentives and incentives linked to conditionality will take care of institutional change in these countries. Yes, that is, so this idea that deepening and widening are two different realms, and you don't have to deal with the two at the same time, were dominating. Now, one of the most important lessons of the Eastern enlargement extension is that the reason why the Eastern enlargement was at least a relative success relative to the Southern enlargement, relative to the Eastern neighborhood policies, that the EU didn't take its own prejudices seriously. And there was some supranational institution building, there was some deepening in the integration mechanism during the enlargement that allowed actually for relative, I always stress, relative success of the Eastern enlargement. Yes, that the EU already by 92, when it formulated the criteria of taking these countries, formulated already 3 fears that needed some supranational action and supranational institutional building. One was that these countries will not remain or will not stay democracies or will not be, so they had a conditionality and monitoring capacities they built up for democracy in these countries. The other was the fear that they will not have a functioning market economy. The third was that even if they have a functioning market economy, they will not be able to withstand the competitive pressure, that they will have backward economies with firms that have lack the resources, are not competitive enough, and so on and so on. So there was a fear that these countries will not be able to play by the rules of the EU, or even if they play by the rules, they might collapse. And so they impose enormous costs on the core member countries that needs some action. So during the enlargement, the EU mobilized relatively considerable institution building energies to create a network of institutions consisting of bureaucracies from within and within the new members or would-be new member states and from the old member states, banks, investment banks, international financial organizations, thousands of experts, bureaucrats, advisors, who went into these countries and went sector by sector, policy area by policy area, looking at what are the potential consequences of integration, taking over the rules. What could be the large-scale potential negative effects of integration? What are ways of remedying them? How to create projects in collaboration with the domestic actors to, so to say, improve the developmental effects of that. So that was very important. EU also invested a lot in upgrading of state institutions, judiciary, and the civil service, and different state capacities, from administrative and regulatory capacities to developmental capacities. So that was very important. And now, what were the limitations of these policies? Ex post, what we can see that a very important limitation of these policies was that they were depoliticized. They were done by negotiations among bureaucrats, experts, technocrats, and that played a very important role in weakening democracy and actually even spreading technocratic policy style in this country. The other problem was that they were discontinued after these countries became members. So after the membership was granted to these countries, the EU went back to the strategy that it used already in the southern member states. It's trusting in the market and trusting in the conditionality or sanctioning capacity to maintain all these capacities. That was a very bad assumption that we can see now. And the problem with and I have to mention that I cannot get into details of that. Time is short for that, but that in the eastern neighborhood countries, in Ukraine, the EU didn't use any of these lessons. So it went, for example, the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement was pushed on these countries without the assistance programs, meaning of the size that the Eastern new member states received, without considering the political and economic consequences of it to the degree that it was done in the Central European cases. And we have a paper with Julie Langbein in the Journal of European Public Policy that we describe how this has played a role in internal destabilization in these countries. So if I briefly would like to suggest or summarize what might be the key points from that. One is that integration of these countries is a longer process that doesn't end with the accession. The developmental problems and its political repercussions are there with these countries after the accession. And if the EU doesn't have the supranational capacities to manage these problems, then we have the situation that Poland or Hungary has. So this kind of supranational capacities, and I was really very happy to see an op-ed that just came out, I think yesterday or today, by Andreas Cobilius, that stresses exactly the importance of this kind of supranational institutions. So this is one thing. The other is that state building is a very crucial part of any kind of integration, and not just integration, even the reconstruction, different state capacities. And the third one, and here I would like to end, is that the success, the relative success of in some of the countries in Eastern and Central Europe, in the new member states, was very much the function of the degree that these kind of changes were politicized in these countries, that democratic, they could become part of democratic discussions. That is, to put it in a very simple way, to the degree that these countries were capable of mobilizing political support for the changes that the EU pretty much technocratic management resulted, to the degree there as the success became sustainable. In other countries, after the accession, they were dramatically weakened.
Thank you very much, Professor Bruszt. These are very good points, and I am certain that we will come back to this issue of the importance of state building, as you emphasized, as opposed to a technocratic approach to pushing in the agreements, and the importance of significant assistance and engagement from the EU side to make these agreements successful. And with that, I will turn to Andreas Cobilius. Mr. Kubilius, you have direct experience of the lessons of enlargement. And I also remember that already after 2014, you were then speaking of the idea of a Marshall Plan for Ukraine already at that time. And of course, you followed also in a lot of detail the implementation of the association agreements and DCFTAs and these challenges. And now we have the candidacy for membership. So with these tools on the table, what is it that the EU should offer to Ukraine, and what kind of signal should it send now, hopefully in June or soon then?
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for introduction and good conversation. I can answer in a very simple way. What we expect in June, we expect, of course, positive evaluation from Commission, and then, decision on candidate status, and and then negotiations. But definitely still there is quite a big fight to fight, in different capitals, in different institutions, and that's what is our daily business, and and that's why we in the European Parliament initiated. It was my initiative, and we created a network of parliamentarians and experts, with a nice title, United for Ukraine. And we said that we have, Ukrainians are fighting in the first front, military front with our assistance, with weapons, but we have the second front. It's Western capitals, where we need to fight for, future of Ukraine, using our weapons. Now, why really, it's very important what we are discussing today, and especially in the light of the biggest geopolitical crisis which Europe and European Union is facing, not only Ukraine. The war which Putin started against Ukraine is a huge geopolitical crisis. So one thing is to win the war. Second thing is to make conclusions on our side why we came to that crisis, and and what lessons we need to learn. Maybe there were some mistakes on our side, not only that we know what I don't need to perhaps to speak what I think about Putin, and but also we need to look into the mirror and to ask ourselves very direct questions, and here it comes very simple answers. First of all, I think that one of the mistakes, especially after Maidan revolution, was exactly that EU was not using in an ambitious way its own soft power targeted towards Ukraine. Ukraine was left in some way in the gray zone. Here was an association agreement, we were speaking about the reforms, about possibility of integration, but EU was not able to overcome that difference which stayed till now, when we were listening to EU leaders when they were speaking about Western Balkans, which has candidate status, which has negotiations. Well, we can talk about why negotiations are going so slowly, and what is the difference in between of our experience and Western Balkans. But even that was not given to Ukraine and to other Eastern Partnership countries. The question is why. Of course, we can speak about fatigue of enlargement, whatever. But I think one of the reasons was exactly geopolitical mistake of European Union. Here was some way, EU was not using deliberately, its soft power on a maximum, with maximum ambition, because here was a fear that it can provoke Putin. That Putin will become angry if EU will be more persistent and more ambitious with integration agenda towards EU, towards Ukraine. Then Putin can become, very angry, and something can happen. And that is why Ukraine was left in some kind of gray zone. And that is exactly opposite what we were speaking all the time. That if EU will be weak in that, direction, exactly that weakness will provoke Putin, not the strength of EU. And that is what had happened, In some way, EU created temptation for Putin. If Ukraine is in the gray zone, maybe, he can grab Ukraine, and the West will not react to that, his aggression. So that is why we need to make very clear lessons, to take lessons from that, from this geopolitical crisis. And second thing, which again, so that is one of the reasons why EU needs to take lessons, and EU cannot, leave Ukraine in the gray zone anymore. So that is why candidate status is so much, needed immediately from geopolitical point of view. Second, definitely, I am always repeating, that EU soft power, I mean, promising integration, promising, perspective of membership, is the only instrument which, well, I am not academician. You are, all experts, all scientists. You maybe know much better. But when I am looking into the history, at least of the last 30 years, I do not see any, example, especially looking into the countries, from, socialist camp, post-Soviet countries, which without, enjoying soft power of EU would be able to create their own success. I don't know. I am looking into the map and I don't see any of the countries which were able on their own without, going through integration to become successful, successful country with success of democracy, success of, economy and everything else. There is no any example. So question is very simple. Does EU want to assist Ukraine to become a successful country? It's not a question, does Ukraine wants to become a successful country? We know that Ukraine wants. But the question is why, and does EU wants to create success of Ukraine? And, I saw again lacking of that clear wish on EU side to create success of Ukraine in order really to have, first of all, stability on the borders. That is what, EU for some reasons were not able to understand. Second, success of Ukraine, in my view, is one of the most important soft power instruments which EU can use in order to assist Russia to transform itself back to democracy. Well, maybe it looks like now, as some kind of naive dream, but that is another topic. We can talk, for hours about what is the future of Russia and how it can turn back to democracy. But one of the ways how EU can, help Russia to transform itself to democracy, it's again creating good examples. Success of Ukraine can inspire, first of all, Belarusian people. We saw how they were inspired by Ukrainian example. It can inspire also Russian people. And I will not talk why EU needs to have such an ambition, such a strategy, especially when the war started. Because the only way how to avoid, repetition of the wars on the European continent, initiated by Kremlin, by this, fascist regime, what I call, is really to achieve such a situation that Russia would turn back to democracy, because democracies are not fighting each other. That's what we learned also from history. So those are, several arguments why, I see that EU would make big mistake if, EU will not provide Ukraine with candidate status now, and then, with much more rapid, integration strategy towards EU. EU needs to learn very simple geopolitical lesson. Now, few additional points. One additional thing. It can help even in these war conditions, candidate status. If Ukraine is getting candidate status in June, it changes in some way, I don't know how to call it, paradigm of the war, because Russia will continue war against, country which is a candidate to become EU member state. Not just, Ukraine, which is Ukraine, important country, but Ukraine is becoming candidate status, and Russia is fighting against a country which is, candidate to become member of EU. So what you can talk about Nazism and whatever, all that, propaganda, I think will be in a really very, very, well, it's not our business to know about Russia propaganda, but in any case, I think that it can change a lot of, in this mental understanding on Russian side about the war. And one additional point, what we were discussing in our, network exactly on this, Marshall Plan, what was proposed by that group, which Tymofiy Mylovanov is. Definitely, implementation of Marshall Plan, which can be, and at least we expect that, next week Commission will propose, communication on Marshall Plan. And as we hear rumors, it will be a huge amount of money. It's again different topic where we can speak again from where those money can come, and you were speaking about, something like RRF to zero, borrowing in the markets, and also, sanctions Russian treasures, and so on. But to use those money and to invest those money into Ukraine, it would be much better and much more effective is really if all those investors will know that Ukraine really is approaching all the EU standards, regulations, legislations, and so on and so on. So that would be some kind of guarantee of, that really money will be spent on that, European European rules on European basis. So that's again why I see that candidate status is really, it's very much needed. But but here our fight should not stop, because we know, especially from Western Balkans, that the country can get candidate status, and then and then nothing is happening. After candidate status, country is not getting getting negotiations. So, or if country is getting negotiations, then again nothing is moving ahead. So in some way, I see the need for EU also to look much more deeply into its own, enlargement policy, enlargement philosophy, which, because, well, that is again the question to you, experts and scientists. Why really EU lost in this enlargement philosophy something what it had, back in 1990s when we were going through, enlargement. For us, EU enlargement, policy and that soft power of EU was, the huge motivating, factor for us to move ahead, to have clear goals, and to stabilize ourselves, because we were also doing all the mistakes, what was possible to do. I'm always saying that, especially we Lithuanians, Catholic country, I am calling that we are Italians of the North, and we were switching from one side to another side in political, life, and the only thing which was keeping us on track was membership perspective. That was really, that did great job. Now it's not bringing the same outcome, for example, in Western Balkans. And I see really exactly that EU is not anymore having this, political will inside of EU, really to have those countries as real members. In our case, we were feeling that EU has a wish, to have us on as a members. So now we need to look, more deeply into why it's so. What are the fears inside of EU? Why EU is not, able to move with the enlargement? Some countries are complaining about exactly, that decision making is becoming very problematic when we have, Hungary and Poland and so on and so on. But well, again, I hope that out from this, geopolitical crisis, some of those, much smaller problems inside of EU would be overcome. Of course, there are different scenarios how enlargement can go. I would be very happy if discussions should start about really philosophy. One philosophy is how we went through, like, chapter by chapter, opening of different chapters, and then, and we need to prove, through that integration process that we are good, and in the end we're getting, license of the membership. But here was another practice, which I wrote also a small piece at the very beginning when Zelensky signed an application. I said, look, guys, but here was, for example, experience of Eastern Germany, which became member of EU, through reunification with Western Germany, and during one night, and the difference, if you compare with us, was very simple. We were first integrating ourselves, up to the standards of EU, and then we got membership license. Eastern Germany, first of all, got membership license, and then started to integrate, then started to learn how to live with new laws. And they did it, It's also possible. Now, or we can go, with some kind of what we were proposing with middle way, to start negotiations and to start approach towards first of all, to have also, way, in some way, in two stages. First of all, to enter into single market, to achieve, membership in European Economic Area, like it was done by the Nordic countries, and then to jump up to the membership. But at least to come out from this impasse of European enlargement policy, which is really, as I said at the very beginning, in some way, it provided, some conditions for this geopolitical crisis which we're facing now. And I stop here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cobilius. And you have put so much on the table. There is a lot to unpack, and already you posed several very good questions that I would like to actually pose to Professor Vachudova now, and see what analysis we can get on some of these issues. For instance, what went wrong in the philosophy on enlargement, and what can we learn specifically of some of the stagnation and backsliding that the Western Balkans have experienced. And then, what is the case for EU integration of Ukraine? How can that case be made to some of the reluctant member states?
Mm-hmm. These are wonderful. These are very good and very challenging questions. I'm just wondering, Tymofiy, do you want to go speak before me? Because I know you're traveling and you may have a good connection right now.
No, I can wait. I thank you very much for your patience. It's just, yeah, we're constantly traveling here in Ukraine, and I really was in a bad spot. But now I'm good and safe, and everything is fine, should be. So I can wait. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding.
No problem. So I'll be relatively brief. Also being a woman.
No. Don't. At least not because of me. Don't feel. I'm good. I'm well. Yeah.
Thank you. No. I'm just, Anyway, so yes, thank you. These are really important questions, and I think I'll make 4 points. The first one, a bit more perhaps on the academic side. But that is, I think that the European Union finds itself at a really critical watershed moment. I like to call it a wake-up call. So it's a wake-up call as a result of Russia's war against Ukraine. And I think it may have positive benefits for European politics and European integration, but I want to stress that these come at enormous, unimaginable costs for Ukraine in terms of lives lost, unimaginable human suffering, and cities being destroyed. And so it's, I think one of the things we have to do right now is think about everything with a sense of urgency, because we can talk in terms of long-term impacts on European integration and whether the EU will regain its geopolitical ambitions in a constructive way, and that is very important for Ukraine. But some of these things are happening right now and need to happen in the next 2 or 3 months. So if not 2 or 3 months ago. So first of all, the question of the fight for liberal democracy within the EU. So I think the EU, many EU member states, and I want to make sure that's clear, EU member states have been privileging geopolitical stability and economic profit over liberal democracy. And this war shows that this does not work. The EU cannot function. This has become essentially the worst and the best possible evidence for the fact that the EU that privileges geopolitical stability, economic profits, getting along over liberal democracy ends up in big trouble. So 2 things. First of all, the project that Viktor Orban has, along with fellow travelers, to decouple European integration from the regime type of liberal democracy. Now, if he's successful, this would be a dramatic deterioration of the EU's potential to be a geopolitical power and potential to revive the EU enlargement process, as Prime Minister Kubilius mentioned, in a way that is successful like it once was. And this is a little awkward, right? Because Poland, which is such a great friend to Ukraine and gives such important military assistance, is also that party, the Law and Justice Party, is a party that is attacking liberal democracy within the EU and degrading it. And as I like to tell my Polish counterpart, sometimes, this has been doing the work of Putin in the sense that it's been weakening the European Union. So this is a problem that is, but there's hope for Poland, I think, right now, because what some of my Polish colleagues tell me is that Professor Volchik, for example, mentioned this recently, that anything that is seen as anti-EU is now presented as pro-Russian. And so this may limit how Law and Justice behaves in the future in terms of degrading EU law, in terms of vilifying the LGBT community and so forth. The second problem is Germany. Germany has for such a long time privileged economic profit with this very 1990s argument of through trade, we somehow bring peace and democracy to Russia. And this has essentially meant that the pipelines have been pumping corruption directly into German politics, directly into the SPD, but also into the CDU. I'm an academic, so I get to say these things. And it's not only that, right? It's also the fact that the CDU covered for Orban. He essentially made authoritarian rule in Hungary costless for Viktor Orban from the point of view of from the point of view of the EU. Now, France is also a problem. Very low, I think only 0.03% of its defense budget in terms of military assistance to Ukraine so far. Macron playing this absurd, if traditional French position of trying to be some kind of a geopolitical player between Washington and Moscow. This is worrying because the French-German motor matters. The EU itself, we talk a lot about the EU, but at the end of the day, it's member states and how member states essentially come to the EU table, especially the big ones that matters. But I do see a positive side in that I see those political parties in EU member states that have been pro-Kremlin and ethno-populist, their position at home is weakening. Now, why does this matter concretely? One way it matters very much is the revival of the EU accession process as a tool of an expression of the EU's commitment to liberal democracy, as a geopolitical tool that helps promote and foster and support Ukraine and other countries on their path. And in order for that to happen, EU accession process, which has been completely moribund now for over a decade, needs to be revived as a meritocratic process. And is this meritocratic process that was once more or less there, it's never going to be perfect, we all know. It needs political will, absolutely, on the outside, incredibly strong political will, as the candidates in the 90s benefited from. Like, we are going to enlarge, these countries are coming in someday. And then inside, a meritocratic, technocratic process. And this is the process in which I think Ukraine can shine, because it can show that when it comes to the very technical process of adopting tens of thousands of pages of acquis communautaire and implementing them, we are going to see how sort of the state capacity that Ukraine has demonstrated already, since 2014. This is not something that's and before, it's not something that happens overnight, but we see the capacity of the state at the very local level, the village level, all the way up to the national level. Well, this state capacity combined with political will is what you need to get through the process. And so Ukraine, in a meritocratic, technocratic process scaffolded by political will, can jump ahead of other candidates in the queue. But that doesn't mean those other candidates shouldn't be also treated differently, right? So, for example, North Macedonia and Montenegro are countries, for example, that have done an incredible amount of work to qualify for EU membership and have been punished by the lack of political will. The final thing I'll say is, in terms of looking back at past accessions and thinking about what might be more useful, I think about Slovakia, for example, a country that had a political transformation in 1998 with Vladimir Mečar's government being voted out of power. And it was really like a critical moment for Slovakia, as this will be a critical moment for Ukraine. And the EU accession process essentially helped create kind of not blueprints so much, but guardrails, or a set of things to do that helped concentrate domestic politics on technocratic issues, on issues of delivering things like education and environment and healthcare. And I think helped, in my research, I show that in all EU candidate countries, you have these moments where all parties in the parliament are in support of getting into the European Union. And this is an important moment when a lot of work can be done. And unfortunately for the Western Balkan states, that moment sort of came and went and came, and now it's, that energy has dissipated. And my final point is that success in the EU pre-accession process depends on the political will. It depends on a robust technocratic meritocratic process. It depends on the national government, but it also depends on bottom-up pressure and activity inside the country. And again, here I feel optimistic about Ukraine. In Slovakia, that bottom-up pressure, the organization of civil society, the fact that even when you have a democratic pro-EU government, you still have strong accountability coming from civil society. That I think is really important.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed also for highlighting this process of internal disintegration that we see in the EU itself, and how enlargement could in a way become a way for the EU to redeem itself and to reestablish that commitment to democracy and governance and values. And we will certainly come back to the issue of how this war is changing the EU and how it might change it in the future. And I think this is where also many of these questions come in. But I would like to now bring in Tymofiy Mylovanov, and I'm really pleased that he's able to join us in a stable and safe place, I hope, with a stable internet connection. And we're very much looking forward to hearing from him. You are one of the authors of a proposal, together with a number of other prominent economists, of a blueprint for reconstruction of Ukraine, a sort of a Marshall Plan that was actually already mentioned by a few of our speakers. And you argue also in that proposal, and this was briefly referred to, that reconstruction should go hand in hand with integration, and that the two processes are really important to reinforce and sustain each other. Could you say more about that and more generally about how you see the reconstruction of Ukraine?
Thank you very much, and thank you for your understanding and patience. It was supposed to be okay with my internet, and we tested it, but then something went wrong. Things are not always stable here. And I've been maybe to many panels and at least or discussions, and over the last 2.5 months, at least 3 of them I had to go to a shelter during because there would there would be a warning and a rate, and that's another interesting evolution, how you get used to these things and you gradually start to ignore them, and then the government comes up with a color system. Now we have red warnings and yellow warnings, so they're kind of more extreme, so alert people. So war is a very different it's a very different environment in which you somehow, it's easy to stop connecting with the rest of the world, which is not experienced the war. So, I try to bring myself back to the academic world, and I try to speak in the language that I would have spoken had I been in the US or in Europe, and I'll try a little bit of that. But then I also will speak as a citizen of Ukraine to explain what the EU might mean for us at this stage. So from the reconstruction perspective, from the resilience, let's start with the resilience. The war is there. The intensity in the East is more extreme, perhaps, than it was in the Battle of Kyiv. It's not very, it's difficult to see it in the news because, it has been, it's been weeks now and people have gotten used to it, and the journalists don't cover the most extreme areas of fighting. But at least I think it was recently on the news that Russia has lost over the last 2-3 days 70 vehicles just in one location, trying to cross a river. So it tells you at least it's a symptom of how bad things are in the East. And we start seeing a lot of friends who have died. And at the university, at the Kyiv School of Economics, we're seeing alumni, especially business school alumni, from military veterans programs, but also from regular alumni who are now, who are not with us anymore. And so we're getting used to it. Unfortunately, you get used to it. It's a part of life. And so I think if Ukraine doesn't get immediate or kind of ongoing support, fiscal, macro support, then we will see the collapse of the economy sometime in June, July. I'm not saying it publicly, but we can probably discuss that here, at least at the panel. It's not it's not a TV station. So there'll be limited outreach as a result of that. But if you look at the fiscal needs of Ukraine, we have about $5 to $8 billion a month, and our revenues, our tax revenues, are 1/3 of what they were, and our expenditures are higher, and so the gap is covered so far by borrowing. So we have been borrowing money domestically and internationally. Borrowing means essentially printing money. So we can regulate the prices and keep inflation at bay for a while, but we're printing money. We cannot print them, in unlimited amounts. We're also getting a lot of support from the West, from the EU, from Canada, from from the US, but only 20% of that support, and I'm talking about economic support, I'm not talking about military support. Only 20% of this is grants. The rest is loans. So the debt is growing at an unprecedented rate. And you have seen some of the language in the recent bill in the US suggesting debt relief already, but it's still talking about essentially debt. So if you, and so far we haven't seen a lot of grants, neither from the EU, there's some from the EU, but mostly it's coming from the US. Even macroeconomic, macrofin support from the EU, it's a loan. The IMF support, of course, it's a loan. The World Bank support, it's a loan. And the amounts of those loans are limited, something like 600 million euros. Well, it's the cost, it's today cost of the war. This is what we're getting macrofin. Of course, no one owes anyone $1, but realistically, there's a second front in this war, and this is an economic front. And if it's not being addressed soon enough, we will have a difficulty by June, July. The Minister of Finance is saying, the minister is saying that we will not default, and I'm not saying we will, but the debt might become unsustainable. And in that way, if it becomes unsustainable, that will be a win for Russia, because Russia is able to make payments on its debt despite the sanctions and everything else, and Ukraine might not be able to. And so it just somehow Russia, it's a political win for Russia. Russia will claim, see, we told you so. The West will abandon Ukraine economically for sure. And there are symptoms of that, because if you look at the recent fundraising by the president, the president has now a united account. We raised $25 million over a week there, and 23 of them are for military assistance, and the rest is, we basically raised nothing for humanitarian, something like less than $1 million, and several hundred for recovery. It's a joke. So we see that in the support, the appetite is for the military support, but not really for economic or humanitarian support. And it's truly troubling. It was very different in the beginning of the war. There was no problem getting humanitarian support or even economic support. Now it's very different. Everyone is willing to support militarily, but people are not willing to support the economy. And this is going to be a problem. So that's on the recovery. And I think recovery has to start now. So we need to run those agencies that we discussed in our blueprint and elsewhere now. We should not wait until the end of the war. And I also don't think there will be a very clear end of the war, because this war formally is not even declared by the Russian Federation. They don't even admit they are in war. And they're not going to admit, or if they are going to admit that the war is over, or there will be some settlement at some point, clearly the risk will not disappear, because they have been escalating over the last decades multiple times without any warnings in the most extreme case. So the risks will not disappear. So I think we're looking at the environment where we will have a risk of war going on for a long time until Russia, as the current regime, implodes. And recently I want to just quote Timothy Snyder. He was at the Kyiv School of Economics this Tuesday, and someone asked him a direct question: what do you think is needed so Russia changes its behavior and becomes less aggressive? He says they have to be defeated, because until they are defeated in some meaningful sense, be it economic or military or something else, they will not change their behavior, because they need to process it, and they need to have, they need to change the way, they're using force in the world which would like to use soft power, as we discussed in the beginning of our panel, the one I was fortunate to catch that part. And they don't believe in the soft power. They believe in military force at this point. And in order to change their behavior, they have to learn in some way that they can't achieve their objectives by military force. And until it happens, and it's not going to happen soon, Russia is a threat to the idea that we can prosper and defend ourselves by soft power rather than military power. And so it's a very unpleasant situation for the world to be in, for Europe to be in. We either have to choose that we're going to defend ourselves militarily against a power which doesn't believe in prosperity and trade, or we have to defeat it in some meaningful way so it changes its behavior. These are the choices that we are facing as, in Europe. In Ukraine, we are facing a very different choice. Our choice is to survive. I think we either going to be, given to the mercy of Putin, and we have seen that mercy. So that means that our leadership, our civil society, our leaders will be executed or will be in exile. Or alternatively, we'll have to fight. And so in that sense, the idea or the promise of joining the European Union gives us a hope that there is some fairness in this world. That's an anchor. It's one of the very few remaining anchors that we have. Now we rely on ourselves, but when we look at the rest of the world, often we feel betrayed, and rightly so, wrongly so, starting with the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, then going on with Kharkiv agreements, and then we had Minsk I, Minsk II, and Crimea, and we wish we say that we wish the sanctions like that were imposed or had been imposed in Russia in 2008 when Georgia was attacked, or maybe in 2014. Maybe we wouldn't have had 2022 then. But sanctions always came, and any response came a little bit too little and too late. And indeed, I think the economic, in many ways, corruption, especially through energy, has touched upon the behavior, has affected the behavior of Germany and some other European countries, made the EU vulnerable to Russian leverage. And so we hope that the EU will find strength to put humanity above the internal politics and economic interests and free riding problems, and be true to what we all would like the EU and the Western civilization, the free world, to be. And we also hope that in some meaningful, although symbolic sense, Europe will recognize us as Europeans. Because if we don't deserve, or we are not recognized to be part of the European family of the free countries or liberal democracy, as we have just been talking about it, then we are in a very dark place in Ukraine. That's how it feels here. It might or might not be objective, I understand that no one owes anyone anything. But I'm just sharing how it feels here on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tymofiy. And it's a very powerful statement, and difficult to also come back to more concrete and somewhat smaller issues as they might seem when we begin to discuss the specifics of what the EU is doing or could be doing. But I hope that this powerful message that you've just sent on the important signal and symbolism of confirming the status that this is being heard. And I actually want to follow up on some of the things you have mentioned, because your message was very clear that recovery needs to start now and money is needed now, significant assistance in the form of grants, not just in the form of loans. And we also know that a lot of the assistance that has been pledged is only at the levels of pledges at the moment and hasn't really reached accounts. as well as being a lot of it for military and humanitarian needs, which are certainly important, but not necessarily for the needs of running the state and everything else that is necessary for the functioning of the Ukrainian state and economy. So I wanted to raise this issue of, in addition to that substantial financial assistance that is needed, what are the other tools that can be mobilized? I mean, we know that the European Commission has now proposed to liberalize, to drop all tariffs and tariff quotas on Ukrainian products. This is an exceptional measure, but it would actually be good to be made permanent. It would be interesting to hear how much of a difference you think that would make, and any of these other steps that could be taken in the immediate term to concretely support the Ukrainian economy, Ukrainian businesses, and take steps under the association agreement and DCFTA for quick integration into the EU single market. And then the other element to this, the candidate status, confirming the candidate status, what would that also bring in practice? We know that there should be access to IPA-style financing, for instance, pre-accession funds that could help with access to structural funds and helping with work to bring greater cohesion and close the development gap with the EU. These are just some things that I wanted to throw out there, and I'm sure that there are also other specific recommendations to make. I'll come back. I'll start with you now, Tymofiy, and then we'll go to the other speakers on these points.
All right, so if we talk about specific structural things, the liberalization of tariffs and regulations on quotas and restrictions is really helpful on two levels. One is it does help economy, sends signal, not only symbolic, but in terms of forming expectations. But it also actually reduces the regulatory burden, because you need to demonstrate fewer, it's just less paperwork, and it is helpful. During the wartime, it's really difficult to get paperwork done. So, any kind of liberalization, making things simpler, could mean a lot of help. On what else can be done, I think there's one very specific issue present in Ukraine, in the economy right now. The institutional investors, large funds, IFIs have difficulty continuing supporting and investing, financing the existing projects, and have difficulty engaging in the reconstruction or any other simply good commercial projects. That's hurting the economy to an extreme. And the difficulty is that it's very hard or impossible in practical terms, bureaucratically, to separate the commercial risk from the war risk. So if you have an analyst at an institution thinking about providing, let's say, financing to a developer, they will say, let's wait until the end of the war. Why? Because, you had your 3 warehouses burned, you want to build another one, what happens? If it's going to get bombarded too, okay, that's fine. But, we cannot put a probability on this. We do not have a procedure. We're not authorized to ensure it's force majeure risk. And in other words, it has been done by shareholders of the institutions. It has to be a political decision of the owners, of the governments, or maybe investors, that we are willing to insure the war risk, and we can put a number on it. And then there will be capital. It's okay to have more expensive capital, and then the war premium can be subsidized perhaps by the government or by the international community. But until the banks, the funds have a procedure in place, they cannot put a number on it. So nothing gets done. This is one example. Another example of the regulation, you take a European or US company, which is, let's say, it's a real example, a company from Boston, procuring IT services from Ukraine. The compliance department doesn't separate between the war in Ukraine or the war somewhere else. And so it actually says that the war in Ukraine is a legal risk for them, and the code which is written, an IT code which is written in the country, which is in war, is not safe. Cannot be considered safe, we cannot insure it, and so we really have to abandon a platform development with you. So that's the type of risk have to be insured too, because, or a third example, a company which is originally from Mariupol, actually, which a holding which used to own Azovstal, Akhmetov's, SKM, large oligarchic company, Metinvest company, the metallurgical company, would like to procure bulletproof vests and medical equipment from the EU, but they cannot make a payment now because from the perspective of the EU payment system, they are in Mariupol and Mariupol is under control. They are not physically in Mariupol, but they are legally registered in Mariupol, and they're in the bank branch which was in Mariupol. Of course, it's operational online, but they cannot make the payments because all the red flags go on. So there are a lot of technical issues we have to resolve right now so the businesses can continue to operate. And there's no just blank denial of services or force majeure declaration because you are in Ukraine. In this way, you're shutting down the economy completely. We are open economy, half of our GDP was export. If everyone is going to declare risk on us, or we cannot, people are concerned that we're going to call force majeure clauses because of war. So we are not, we're not a party to any contractual obligations. No, it's not enforceable. So we have these technical issues such as how to separate between potential force majeure and not, how can we commit not to call a force majeure, because of war, even though we're in war. Can our clients be exempt from the compliance risks because they ordered services from us or products from us? So these are very specific measures which would help very specific companies. So that's on the technical side. The second set of questions you asked, and I'll just make one remark on that, was how would the EU accession or the EU candidacy help? That would streamline domestic politics. So Russia has been very successful at two ways to polarize Ukraine over the years. One is they make this narrative, it doesn't really matter. Politicians are all cynical. Don't believe the Western democracy values. They're all hypocritical. They are the same as us. So if not, why to resist? That's the message they are selling domestically, and that's the message that it is appealing potentially to a part of population. The second one has to do with corruption. They say, listen, look at your government. Your government is corrupt, and partly it is true. But then they abuse this message because they ignore all the positive things and all the positive leaders and ideals that some of members of the government represent. They're not saying that the government is heterogeneous. There's old guard, new guard. There's new guard which has become corrupt. There's old guard which has reformed. So look at Ukraine. It's from black to white. Everyone, from patriot to a traitor. And of course, the majority are patriots and the majority are Democrats. But they forget that in the narrative, and they're saying, people don't believe your officials because here's an example of corruption, here's an example of that. And so they polarize the society and they erode trust in the government. And it's very difficult to build a democratic country and actually fight corruption if people become disillusioned and they don't trust that the change is possible. So some kind of very procedural way forward that we can measure our progress objectively would be helpful to unify our politicians. So we would be less engaged in the argument what is corruption, who is corrupt or not, because there are no objective measurements. And we would be more engaged whether we introduce these institutional reforms, whether we standardize these principles, and whether we pass this legislation. And we'll be saying that, listen, we are 10% of the timeline, or we're 20% of the timeline. Things have to become measurable. And here the EU candidacy and specific process can be very helpful to make progress objective in Ukraine, to undermine the attempts of Russia to polarize our politicians, and to streamline and coordinate their behavior in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Very good point. I invite also our other panelists to come in on this. So both the issue of concrete immediate steps and then also what the candidate status itself can unlock as immediate support to Ukraine.
I just jump in real quick on his very last point there, because in a way, this was the argument in my book, right? That when I was looking at the candidates that entered in 2004 and also in 2007 is that, from the point of view of domestic politics, you do have these clear, observable milestones that you need to meet. And the commission sort of tells you whether or not you're meeting them. Now, it's not a perfect process, but things like professionalization of the state administration, having an independent civil administration, having things like decentralization and building up state capacity at different levels. So in those kind of yearly or bi-yearly reports that the commission will write about the progress of a candidate state, you can then have sort of not perfect, but certainly visible ways in which to evaluate how the government is doing. And when everyone agrees that the goal is to join the European Union, this can create quite a lot of political will to accomplish those reforms. But as I say, that pressure can come both from Brussels, but also from domestic actors. That's really, really important. And I think what Tymofiy said about the geopolitical importance of being a candidate status, and Mr. Cobilius said it as well, it is, I think, critical in the sense that, the ultimate prize of sitting at the EU table, it's a very big economic prize, but it is also a profound geopolitical prize, especially from the perspective of countries in Eastern Europe who find themselves finally not just sitting at the table, but protected by the rules of the EU from bullying. And, that kind of bullying and various things, for example, poor North Macedonia, what it had to deal with Greece. But I really think that geopolitical aspect of it is very important. But the actual work of getting in is so much about reforming the state and implementing the acquis.
Please, Mr. Kubilius.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, but very briefly, definitely, to become a candidate country and to move through negotiations, it's something, very big achievement, and especially membership, well, I will not expand on that, I can say very simply, I looked into our numbers, into the history of our numbers, even if you are looking simply into economy. So back in 1999, 5 years before we became members of EU in 2004, our GDP per capita in PPP terms was 36% of EU average. Now is around, almost 90%. So that is what for us, EU membership brought. So this is one thing that for country like Lithuania, like Central European countries, and the same would be for Ukraine. It's really big benefit. Integration into single market, and all again, European traditions of political life. Of course, we are still young democracies. We're making whatever mistakes. Some countries are really going into deep trouble, like Hungary or Poland. But if you look even to old Europe, you can look into Italy 5 stars, or Greece recently, Syriza, and so on. So it's the question of well, it's another topic, democracy. What is happening with democracies globally and in Central Europe? So it's another topic. But candidate status for Ukraine is very important for EU itself. That's my message also. And here, really, still we need to fight the battle, especially inside of EU. I see really quite a different approach of United States, of Great Britain, which I admire, what they are speaking out, what is the need to defeat Russian army, how much of support is needed, and Europe, which is still in some way I would say, well, improving, maybe behaving better than we were expecting, but still is lacking behind. And that is why we need to target in some way mentality of European Union. European Union needs to understand that the basis on which Europe was living for last I don't know how many years, since end of Second World War, that here is possible of peace and stability on the European continent, that is attacked in a very heavy way. Still, Europe perhaps is not understanding that what is at stake, and that is why Europe needs, first of all, to say to itself, that this is our war. This is not only Ukrainian war. This is our war, and that's why we need to mobilize all our, resources, not just, because we are, good in our hearts and maybe we shall help a little bit, No, it's our war. It's, it's good that Ukrainians are fighting, with all their courage, and so on and so on. But they are fighting our war. And then, we need to look in a very clear way. So what is needed for that victory? For example, we calculated now again in our United Ukraine Working Group on weapons delivery. I trust those experts who have said, that each day Ukraine is losing or is spending armament around, in the value of around 400 million euros, which means that if you will look till the end of the year, Ukraine will need armament around of 100 or 120 billion euros. The promises which till now Ukraine got, it was around of 10 billion. Okay, now Americans are coming, with land lease and with additional money. But Europe is still staying on the level of, 1.5 now, maybe additional money for peace facility. This is not serious. It's not our war, it means, then for Europeans. Then second, what we got again information, for example, that I don't know how it's situation now, maybe Tymofiy now, knows, of course, much better, but we got an information that it was somewhere the first months after, war started, that since Ukraine has 10 million internally displaced persons, so each day Ukraine needs to have around 15,000 tons of food supply through humanitarian channels of aid. Ukraine is getting only 5,000 tons of that assistance. So it means that the system based on voluntarily, provision of humanitarian aid is not working. Are we stepping in as as an organization, as an institution? No, not. President Zelensky is asking very, very good, I see that as possibility, to create a patronage system that member states of EU, maybe together with United States, with Canada, should take patronage, on different regions of Ukraine. It's still not coming. So, so besides what I'm saying, that candidate status for Ukraine should be some trigger for EU, also. Really to understand that this is our war, we need to mobilize our resources, and that is a way how really the peace can be guaranteed on the European continent.
Thank you. Professor Bruszt, would you like to come in also on this issue? And perhaps just before you come in, actually, let me put, because we just have a few more minutes left, we've used up all of our time, but I do want to raise this question, and it has come through the question also from our listeners. This idea that President Macron now floated on the 9th of May, which also the idea of a political European political community that could possibly include Ukraine and the UK, which also comes on the heels of the conference on the future of Europe and the ideas that surfaced through that. So how is this war going to serve as an impetus to think of the reform of the EU? But also, how would you respond to this proposal, which the Ukrainian government also has made very clearly is not necessarily supportive of, if it will in any way take away from its prospect of fully fledged integration into the EU? So, Professor Bruszt, I'll come to you now with this question and also the previous one, and then we'll go back to everyone else, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thanks so much. I cannot add too much to what Tymofiy Mylovanov said about the importance of the candidate status. Now, it's from the internal politics is very important, and from the perspective of mobilizing strengths for the continuation and ending of this war, it's very important. And I cannot agree more, and I will not repeat what he said, because that was formulated in such a strong way. And I completely agree with Andreas Cobilius about the importance of granting this status for the EU itself. The EU's biggest problem is the territorial fragmentation of solidarity. Milada briefly mentioned actually elements of that how the self-interests of member states, and first of all, the largest member states play a role in shaping the external policies of EU, which is unthinkable. So if you should imagine like the US foreign policy or geopolitics shaped by the governor of California or by the New York State. This is really a status that it's in the interests of the EU. It's in the self-love of the EU member states to decrease this kind of fragmentation of solidarity. So that's why I think that an ambiguous statement on what is the EU's vision about the post-war settlement in Europe, geopolitical, economic, political, is needed, because that forms part of it. It's very hard to imagine, if you start from this point, to say that long-lasting peace and prosperity in Europe can be achieved without Ukraine's membership, exactly because of the reasons what Andreas Cobilius so clearly said. So that's important, and that's why I think that the Macron proposal will not meet this criteria. It's in the interest of EU to imagine the worst case scenario. Let's say in a few years from now, Trump coming back to power in the US, the war still going on. Perhaps I wish that would not happen, but this is really the worst case scenario, and EU still having a political system in which foreign policy and the geopolitics and the future of Europe is decided by this kind of fragmented regime. So it's in the interest, and I cannot stress this more, it's in the interest to use this as a focal point, as a clear issue in which very strong statement could be made about the future of the Europe and European integration.
Thank you. Mr. Mylovanov, are you still with us? Or do you hear us, and would you like to make any final point specifically to this proposal by President Macron that we just heard?
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I am, it's very useful for me and for us to have these discussions, and for Ukrainians too, to know, to have a deeper understanding of diverse viewpoints. It sounds like a tautology or simple platitudes, but this is important because we don't always see how the situation, what kind of issues and challenges in the EU is facing. I'll be short on Macron proposal. I think it was not received well. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kubilius.
Yeah, look, I agree with I'm quite skeptical, but luckily, we learned from the first term of Macron that he likes to speak, what he calls big narratives, but then nothing is happening. So, okay, he spoke something which I don't know if he can explain what does it mean, political community. But for me, again, I'm coming from a little bit opposite angle. Macron was trying to explain how difficult it is to enlarge Europe, and to integrate, for example, Ukraine. And I'm more and more asking myself, so why really is that really so difficult? What are real problems? What are the problems? Ukraine is a rich country. Okay, its resources maybe economically that potential was not used in a best way, but this is a country which has huge economical potential now, a lot of natural resources, industrial bases, educated people. So, from my point of view, looking from economical point of view, Ukraine can enrich, EU. That's what I see as possibility. EU can become stronger. I am not talking about even about Ukrainian army, which would strengthen NATO. But when we're talking about EU, so EU can become much stronger, especially and when we are looking into global competition. On one side China, on another side United States. Why Europe is afraid to become stronger? That's for me. It's something what I cannot understand, and I cannot get the point. Okay, I understand that there are some institutional problems like decision making. It's better to move maybe to qualified majority voting. Consensus is too difficult, and if EU will expand, it will have 36 members with all the Western Balkans. Some of them maybe will be, again, not so, loyal to EU, and there will be problems. Okay, let's move to qualified majority voting. That's the issue which we need to resolve. Or, let's say, if each country will have commissioners, and, it will be unrolled government of EU, with 36, ministers and so on and so on. Let's resolve that problem. But let's not talk that, integration of Ukraine is such a difficult task that we cannot move forward. We need to create something new, like, political, community. It's something not serious. I understand that, for Ukraine to accept all the regulation, all the standards will take time. It's not so easy, but it's not decades, like somebody is telling, and it's not the problem for EU itself. So EU needs to really start to not to be afraid to use its own soft power. That is the biggest problem. That EU is afraid sometimes to use its own power, its own potential.
Thank you. And final words also to Professor Vachudova.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I'll make 3 points. Point number one is that, the idea by Macron was terrible. First of all, we already have a Council of Europe. So if we want to have some European organization, let's make that work better. Certainly, I think that Hungary and authoritarian rule in Hungary has hurt the cause of enlargement, because it's easy for those looking for reasons to put it on the shelf to make these arguments. Well, we're going to end up with more Hungaries. Sorry, Hungary. But I think there are very strong arguments against that I don't have time to talk about now. My second point is about the lens, the Russian lens. So much of what has been debated within the EU, among policymakers, among academics here in the US, so much of it comes from the lens of having been engaged with, studied, spent most of one's energies and resources on Russia, on the Kremlin. And because people were so invested and enmeshed in that, they took up subconsciously, because it was practical, all kinds of narratives about how the world is based on what was being said in Moscow and by the Kremlin. And one of those is corruption in Ukraine. So of course there's corruption in Ukraine. There's also a heck of a lot of corruption within existing EU member states. So the good news is that I think these mental maps that have come from the focus and the use of the Russian lens are now being changed. They're being changed in the most brutal matter at an enormous cost, as I mentioned, in human lives, but it's positive and it's good for the European Union, because once you break that spell of, we just get along with the Kremlin and they're reasonable at the end of the day, you also start, as you see in Germany today, examining the high levels of corruption that the Kremlin pumped into German politics. And lastly, I agree so much with Mr. Cobilius and Laszlo mentioned this need for the EU to become a self-confident geopolitical power. And to do that, it needs to embrace liberal democracy as the foundation, as the anchor of what the EU is. And that's going to be hard. And it's hard to do that and deal with the war in Ukraine at the same time. But what the war in Ukraine can help the EU do is realize that in order to prosecute a foreign policy that is effective and that has public support, you need to have clear ideological narrative for why you're doing it. So this is a liberal democratic country that is part of Europe, that's one of us, if you want to use that terminology. And second, that these domestic, that we're going to prosecute this foreign policy effectively, we have to take domestic costs. The US is very good at assuming large domestic costs for our foreign policy goals, good and bad. Here is a cause among European publics are pretty united in their support for supporting Ukraine. And so here I hope that politicians, including Macron, will see that, you know, it's okay we can have domestic costs. We can get through it. We don't always have to worry about any domestic costs being a reason not to do something. So with the gas and the energy, we're going to see that very clearly. It may actually be the first time the EU really assumes domestic costs to a foreign policy goal.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With that, I think we are at the end of our time, but I would really like to thank our panelists for very insightful remarks. I would like to thank also the Central European University Democracy Institute for convening this very timely and important conversation. Very special thank you to Tymofiy, Professor Tymofiy Mylovanov, who has joined us from Ukraine, and I really wish him a peaceful weekend to the extent that that's possible. And I wish all of you some rest over this weekend, and just would hand over for any final words to Professor Bruszt to close us down. Thank you very much.
We do not hear.
You are muted.
Yeah, you can. Yes, thank you. I'm always better heard when I unmute myself. So thank you so much, Iskra, for wonderful moderation and sharing of this meeting. And thanks for all of you to come.